joined on the phone today by author Kent Hartman, talking about his book Goodnight, L.A., The Rise and Fall of Classic Rock, the untold story from inside the legendary recording studios. Hey, Kent, how you doing today?
Pretty good. Thanks, Dustin. How are you?
I'm excellent. I'm glad to be speaking with you.
Oh, thanks. Likewise.
Well, let's, I don't only have a few minutes, let's talk a bit about the new book, Goodnight, L.A., The Rise and Fall of Classic Rock. It seems like you could probably write a few books about this time period. What are the listeners in for with this one?
Well, this book is specifically about Los Angeles in the 70s and early 80s, and it's about how that finite period was as good as it gets for rock and roll. That's where what we think of today as classic rock basically came from, and the stories are just amazing.
Yeah, and I noticed you've got basically a who's who of people you spoke with for the book, and you know it's amazing that you were able to track all these people down.
Yes, I worked so hard for years getting interviews with various famous musicians and producers and engineers and record label people and anybody I could find. So yes, you're right.
Well, Ken, what is it exactly about L.A. that made it so special and made people want to flock there to record their albums?
Well, the music industry, originally in the 60s, the music industry was mostly based in New York in the early 60s up through the mid-60s. And then there was this kind of slow, gradual shift by the mid to late 60s to L.A. Part of it was because the film industry was already there, but part of it was because L.A. was becoming the hip place to be. The weather, speaks for itself there, but also all the other things that were of value to bands and musicians, the creature comforts of life, the groupies, the drugs, the the alcohol, the partying, whatever.
Well, when it comes to making records, the producers oftentimes are kind of the unsung heroes, I guess, but producers, out in LA at that time, they probably had just as much impact on those albums as the bands themselves.
They did, and you're right. Producers are so much the unsung people for all the famous music that we all know and love on your station and other stations. In the book, I write about a lot of the producers, particularly Keith Olsen, who was, I liken him to Zelig, if you remember that Woody Allen movie.
Sure.
And Keith Olsen was just seemingly with everyone everywhere. He was producing, if he wasn't producing Santana one minute, it was Fleetwood Mac the next, or the Grateful Dead the next, or Pat Benatar the next, or on and on and on. And so he actually is the main character that runs throughout the book with all this amazing music.
Yeah, I think maybe the average, music fan might not think of, the producers or the studios themselves and the acoustics and the setups and, just everything that has to go into making a good record.
Yes, and it's all vital, and that's why I wrote about it, too, because recording studios aren't really talked about much, but there are, or there were back then in the 70s, there were, between 5 and 10 just, world-famous recording studios there, and I've gotten so many amazing stories about what was going on inside those studios as all these amazing songs were being recorded, by the Eagles and Chicago and Warren Zevon and you name it.
Well, and of course around that time there were other places, like Stax Records or Motown, but it seems like that style of music, kind of I guess what we would call classic rock nowadays, really kind of gravitated towards L.A.
It did, and once it became entrenched and it was just more of the same kind of artists wanted to go there and be part of that, and so it just became basically a movement that just, defined the 70s up through the early 80s until punk and new wave and other things that, power pop in the early 80s began to take over. But there's a reason that classic rock today is still played everywhere. It's stood the test of time better than any other genre of music, and I think the reason is it's the songwriting. The songs were just indelible.
Well, and you mentioned punk bands and new wave kind of coming in, and that's sort of when things started to change in that area. Do you think that's because the studio kind of maybe is another member of the band in a sense with all the different techniques they were using and the different tracking and that sort of thing?
You mean for classic rock?
Right. Most of the albums that were made there, it seemed like they couldn't just be produced live, I guess, in a garage. They had a lot of different things they were using to make it happen.
Right. And that was a big part of it, too. The studio technology had developed to a point where they had a massive number of tracks to record on, and that made a huge difference. Before, when you look at even the Beatles in '67 on Sgt. Pepper's, they only had 4 tracks, 4 separate tracks, meaning they'd put, the drums on one track and the vocals on another, and that's how they would then mix the song together. By the time the '70s came around, in Los Angeles in particular, they had these giant mixing consoles and recording decks that, they could do 72 tracks on a song, which was unheard of. And so it allowed these bands and producers to explore and expand and become the artists that I think they always wanted to be.
Well, Kent, do you know if many of the studios from that time, are they still around today, or have a lot of them just kind of fallen by the wayside, I guess?
Well, studios, because of the advent of Pro Tools today, which is, the software that you can use in your computer, a lot of people are able to actually record at home these days, which is an amazing thing. But those studios, there are a few that still exist in Hollywood, in LA, that were used in the old days, like Sunset Sound and the Village Recorder and a few others. But many of them are gone. One of the main ones I write about in the book is Sound City, and it is no longer in existence, sadly.
Yeah, it does seem just in general now, because of technology advancement, a lot of people have their own studios set up in their house, or, they can do everything on their laptop maybe. So, there aren't a lot of these destination studios left anymore, I suppose.
No, you're actually speaking to somebody who has one. I have a studio in my home. And the laughable part is, I'm not 1/50th the musician that, the Eagles or Chicago or Loggins and Messina or Santana or anybody that I wrote about in the book is, yet I have a better studio in the basement of my home than they did in the early days when they were recording.
Well, I know it's probably tough, Kent, but can you maybe point to a favorite album that came out of L.A. during that time period? Do you have one that you always go back to?
Well, I think that really the seminal album from that period came out in '75, and it was the first Fleetwood Mac album that had Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks on it, the one that had Rhiannon and Over My Head on there. That really changed things. That was a Keith Olsen production, by the way, but it's something that's not talked about a lot, but that album became a huge hit, and that was all of a sudden, now there was a lead singer, a front woman for a major rock band. And, that had really never occurred anywhere before. I don't think Stevie Nicks gets enough credit in that regard. And I have many, many stories about her and Fleetwood Mac in the book in relation to creating that album.
Excellent. Well, again, the book, Goodnight, L.A., The Rise and Fall of Classic Rock, is out now, and it's a fascinating time period for sure. You mentioned you put a lot of work into it. And again, I appreciate your time today, Kent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And again, that was author Kent Hartman and his new book, Goodnight, L.A., The Rise and Fall of Classic Rock, The Untold Story from Inside the Legendary Recording Studios, is available now.